For hours after reading the email, Ethan didn't move. He sat in his chair, staring at the blinking cursor on his half-finished presentation, as if willing it to erase what he'd just read. But the words in the email weren't going away. Your position has been eliminated effective immediately. That phrase echoed in his mind like a siren he couldn't shut off. He didn't call anyone. He didn't even text Rachel. Instead, he closed his laptop slowly, stood up, and walked downstairs in a daze. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and toast. His son was on the floor, tying his sneakers. His daughter was humming as she scrolled through her phone. Everything looked normal. But inside, Ethan felt like he'd been hollowed out. He kissed Rachel on the cheek and said nothing. Just grabbed his keys and left the house like it was any other workday. But instead of driving to the office, he ended up parked at the marina, staring at the gray Seattle water as the morning fog began to lift. He didn't cry. He couldn't. The emotion was there, raw, enormous, but frozen behind a wall he hadn't even known existed. He had been with Horizon Dynamics for nearly a quarter century. Hired right out of grad school. He'd weathered 3 CEO transitions, 2 recessions, and the chaotic rise of digital marketing. He'd mentored interns who now led their own departments. He'd worked late without complaint, missed school recitals, sacrificed vacations, all under the belief that loyalty mattered. And just like that, none of it did. By noon, his phone was buzzing with calls and texts from colleagues. Some had also been laid off. Others were in shock. A few were already packing boxes. One message from Melissa simply said, "It's real." They got me too. He didn't respond. He sat in his car for another hour, his thoughts scattered and looping. He imagined walking back into the building and demanding an explanation. He fantasized about flipping over his desk, screaming that this was age discrimination, that it was wrong, unethical. But the reality was colder, more bureaucratic. The decision had already been made. The paperwork filed. The security badges flagged for deactivation. There was nothing to fight against, no one to blame directly. And somehow, that made it worse. He finally drove home just after 1 in the afternoon. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table, laptop open, concern etched across her face. She looked up the moment she heard the door click. "What happened?" she asked, standing. "Ethan, you're scaring me." He said the words so quietly, she almost didn't hear them. "Then let me go." She blinked. "What? Why?" He dropped his keys on the counter. "They're restructuring, bringing in younger talent. I'm apparently too experienced to fit their vision." She took a step forward. "Are you serious? After everything you've done for them?" He nodded once. "I'm out, Rachel." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them thickened until finally, Rachel moved forward and wrapped her arms around him. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. But the apology didn't help. Nothing would, not yet. Because this wasn't just about a job. It was about identity, about purpose, about waking up and knowing who you are. And suddenly, Ethan didn't know anymore. He sat on the couch for the rest of the afternoon, staring blankly at the television. He wasn't watching anything, just letting the flickering images distract him. His mind kept going back to that moment the email arrived. How casual it had all been. No warning, no respect, just delete. When dinner came, he barely touched his food. His kids noticed but didn't ask. Rachel watched him carefully, the way someone watches a wounded animal, afraid to get too close, but afraid to leave it alone. That night, after the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, Ethan stood in the hallway outside their rooms. He looked in on his daughter first. She was asleep, her math textbook still open beside her. Then he peeked into his son's room, where a baseball glove rested on the floor and a superhero nightlight glowed softly in the corner. He leaned against the wall and exhaled. He hadn't just lost a job. He had lost the illusion of control. The belief that if he worked hard enough, stayed loyal enough, kept his head down, and did everything right, he would be safe. But safety was a myth. The next morning, Ethan didn't set an alarm. There was no reason to, but he woke up early anyway. The habit was too ingrained. He brewed coffee and stood at the window, staring out at the street below. The world hadn't stopped, even though his had. Cars moved. Dogs barked. Joggers passed. He opened his laptop, not to apply for jobs. Not yet, but just to face it, to look his situation in the eye. His inbox was filled with automated HR notices, severance paperwork, Cobra options, legal disclaimers. The subject lines felt like insults. Important next steps. Rebuilding opportunity. Let's talk about your transition. He closed the lid again. Instead, he pulled out a notebook from the desk drawer, one he hadn't used in years. Its cover was cracked, its pages yellowed, but it had once-held ideas. Big ones. Campaigns, product launches, dream collaborations. He flipped through it slowly. On page 16, in his messy handwriting, was a phrase he didn't remember writing. What would you do if you weren't afraid? He stared at those words for a long time. What would he do? He wasn't sure yet, but for the first time since the email, he felt something stir. It wasn't hope exactly, but maybe the memory of hope. A whisper, a breath, a question worth answering. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, I'll start. And this time, it would be for himself. The next morning, the alarm remained silent. But Ethan was already awake, lying in bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He had been up for nearly an hour, listening to the sounds of the world waking up around him. The creak of the floorboards, the distant thud of a car, door shutting down the street, the rhythmic whoosh of Rachel's blow dryer through the bathroom door. It was a regular day for everyone else, but not for him. For the first time in over 2 decades, he didn't have anywhere to be. No team waiting, no calls to lead, no campaign deadlines looming. Just stillness. And that stillness was suffocating. He sat up slowly, rubbed his hands over his face, and exhaled hard. A voice inside him whispered to get up, make coffee, and pretend like everything was fine. But another voice, quieter, more honest, asked, what's the point? He made his way to the kitchen. Rachel was already gone, a note on the counter in her neat handwriting. Thinking of you. Be kind to yourself today. We'll get through this. Love, R. He stared at the note longer than he needed to, then set it down and brewed himself a cup of coffee. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting soft golden light over the breakfast table where his kids used to fight over cereal boxes before school. Everything felt normal, but none of it was. Ethan took his coffee to the living room and sat on the couch, legs folded underneath him like a man unsure if he deserved to take up space. The television was off. His laptop stayed closed. His phone buzzed occasionally, notifications from LinkedIn, emails from Horizon's HR team. But he ignored them all. He didn't want to face the world yet. Instead, he just sat there. For hours. That first full day of unemployment didn't look like a man seizing the opportunity to reinvent himself. It looked like a man drifting. He thought about turning on the TV, maybe watching the news, or diving into a documentary, but the idea of consuming anything, stories, noise, energy, felt overwhelming. So he did nothing. Around lunchtime, he walked into his office and stood in front of his bookshelf. On the third shelf was a framed certificate, Employee of the Year, Horizon Dynamics 2012. It felt like a joke now. He picked it up, stared at it for a while, and then turned it face down. He didn't feel like eating, so he poured another cup of coffee instead. The bitterness of it reminded him of the email. The cheap, corporate language still haunted him. Strategic realignment. Optimizing generational synergy. It was as if a room full of people had brainstormed the least human way to say you're too old and we don't need you anymore. He paced the kitchen, trying to suppress the wave of anger rising in his chest. Not just at Horizon, but at himself, for trusting the system, for believing in loyalty, for thinking that years of service would mean something. At 2:17 p.m., he sat back down and finally picked up his phone. He scrolled through the messages again. One stood out. It was from Melissa Tran. I'm organizing a Zoom for the rest of us. Just a place to talk. You in? He stared at it. His instinct was to say no, to retreat. But another part of him, the part that remembered being a mentor, a leader, a problem solver, pushed back. Maybe this wasn't just about him. He replied, what time? That evening, at 7 p.m., Ethan logged into Zoom for the first time since his last client presentation 2 weeks earlier. The screen filled with familiar faces, all carrying the same tight-lipped expressions. Some looked angry, others just tired, but there was comfort in that shared exhaustion. Melissa greeted him first. Ethan, hey, glad you joined. Hey, he said, forcing a small smile. Thanks for putting this together. There were 8 of them in total, all over 45, all recently laid off, all previously considered pillars of Horizon's legacy departments. They started with silence, then awkward small talk, but slowly, stories began to surface. A senior engineer named Carlos, 52, admitted that he'd started drinking a little too much since the layoff. A project manager, Diane, confessed she hadn't told her adult kids yet, too ashamed to say the words out loud. Melissa shared how she'd applied to 10 jobs and received 0 replies. When it was Ethan's turn, he hesitated. Then he said simply, "I've been pretending I'm okay, but I'm not. I feel erased." Heads nodded across the screen. Everyone understood. It wasn't about losing a paycheck. It was about losing your place in the world, your identity, your sense of purpose. Melissa leaned forward. "I've been thinking about this. What if we did something with this group? Like a resource hub, support for people like us, peer-to-peer mentoring, resume help, real talk about what this transition actually feels like." Someone else chimed in. "We should start something, not just for us, but for everyone who's being quietly pushed out of the workforce like we were." Ethan felt something stir in his chest again. The same flicker he'd felt the day before when he opened that old notebook. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was a pause, or a redirection. He ended the Zoom call that night with something he hadn't felt in days. Not hope exactly, but direction, something to walk toward. And that was enough for now. The next few days unfolded like foggy mornings in early spring. Everything felt muted, his routines, his energy, even the way time moved. Ethan would wake early, make coffee, glance at the framed family photos in the hallway, and then just sit. There were no meetings to prepare for, no schedules to chase, no inboxes demanding his attention. And that should have been a relief. But to a man who'd spent 24 years measuring his worth by deadlines and deliverables, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was punishing. He tried to keep up appearances. He shaved. He helped Rachel with groceries. He even made dinner one night, grilled salmon and roasted vegetables, just like they used to before the job had consumed him. But he didn't say much. And when he did speak, his voice was flat, like it was traveling through static. It wasn't until Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the layoff, that something shifted. It started with a book. Rachel had left it on the kitchen counter without saying a word. A simple paperback with a post-it note on the front. Just read the first chapter. If you hate it, toss it. The title was Second Acts, Reinventing Yourself at Any Age. He picked it up with mild irritation. He wasn't in the mood for self-help or sunshine. But she had asked, and she rarely asked for anything these days. He sat at the kitchen table and flipped to chapter 1. Within 5 minutes, he was still, reading, absorbing. It wasn't the polished motivational quotes or the stories of people reinventing themselves that hooked him. It was the rawness. The chapter began with a woman who had been laid off at 56 from a publishing company, then spent 6 months spiraling into self-doubt before discovering her new path. Not through some grand epiphany, but through small, consistent choices. Trying one thing, failing, trying another, learning, adjusting, trying again. The book didn't promise miracles. It promised effort, grit, ownership, and it reminded Ethan that progress didn't always start with inspiration. Sometimes it started with motion. He closed the book halfway through chapter 2, stood up, and went to his office. He pulled out that old notebook again, the one with the cracked cover, and this time he opened to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote, "What I still know," and underneath it, he made a list. "I know how to lead teams. I know how to listen. I know how to build strategy from chaos. I know how to teach. I know what it feels like to be overlooked." That last one lingered. He stared at it for a while before underlining it. Then he wrote a new sentence beneath the list. "There are more people like me out there. What if I could help them?" It wasn't a fully formed idea. Not yet. But it was a spark, a flicker of purpose. That evening, over dinner, Ethan mentioned the Zoom call he'd joined. Rachel looked up, intrigued. "You're connecting with the others who were let go?" He nodded. "Yeah, we're all in the same boat." And we started talking about creating something, a support group, maybe a place for people to figure out what's next. Rachel chewed thoughtfully. "That actually sounds amazing. You'd be perfect for that." He raised an eyebrow. Perfect? I'm barely holding it together. Exactly, she said. That's what makes you real. People don't want to hear from someone who has it all figured out. They want someone who understands what it feels like to lose everything and still stand up. Her words stayed with him long after the dishes were done and the kids had gone to bed. That night, he pulled out his laptop for the first time in a week, not to check job boards, but to research. He looked up career transition groups, midlife coaching platforms, resources for older professionals. There were a few scattered organizations, but most of them felt dated or overly corporate. He saw an opening, a gap, a need. Then his phone buzzed. It was a message from Melissa. Hey, a few of us are meeting tomorrow for coffee at Union Market. You in? He typed, definitely. Saturday morning arrived with a chill in the air. Ethan drove to Union Market downtown and found the group huddled around a long table near the corner. Melissa waved him over. She looked tired but energized, like someone who'd been running on ideas. Carlos was there too, along with Diane and a few others from the Zoom call. There were notebooks, coffee cups, and a shared understanding that none of them were here to wallow. They were here to build. So, Melissa said, we've been tossing around names. Concepts. What if we created something like a digital hub? Not just for venting, but for real tools. Resume help, job leads, skill workshops, peer mentoring. Ethan listened, and he spoke slowly, carefully. I've been thinking, what if we called it something like gray matter? You know, brains, experience, wisdom, but also the gray hair we've earned. The table laughed, then nodded. That's actually brilliant, Diane said. It's memorable and meaningful. They spent the next 2 hours sketching ideas. What features would the site need? Who could they partner with? Could they run workshops virtually? Ethan's years of marketing experience started to wake up again. Strategy maps formed in his mind. Brand pillars. Target demographics. He hadn't thought in these terms since the layoff, and the return of that mental rhythm felt like stepping back into his own skin. By the end of the meeting, they had a working plan and a shared Google Doc titled Gray Matter, Draft 1. As Ethan drove home, something inside him felt different. Not healed, not fixed, but alive. That evening, he sat on the porch with Rachel, a blanket draped over both their laps. I think I know what I want to do, he said. She looked at him, waiting. I want to help people like me. People who've been tossed aside, told they're too old or too slow. I want to prove them wrong. I want to show them and myself that we're not done yet. Rachel reached over and took his hand. You've never been done, Ethan. You've just been waiting for the right beginning. And as the sun dipped behind the skyline, he felt the weight of the past week start to lift, replaced by something stronger than regret. Direction. Monday morning arrived with a different energy. The kind of quiet intensity that hums in the background when something is about to begin. Ethan stood at his desk with a mug of coffee in one hand and a fresh notepad in the other. For the first time since the layoff, he wasn't haunted by the silence. He was listening to it, using it. Gray matter. Even just saying the name made something shift inside him. It wasn't just a concept anymore. It was becoming real. He sat down and opened a blank document. At the top, he typed mission statement. He stared at the blinking cursor, fingers hovering, then slowly began to write. Gray matter exists to prove that experience is not a relic. It's a resource. We are a platform for professionals over 40 navigating change, reinvention, and the next chapter of their lives. We believe wisdom has weight, and we're here to help carry it into the future. He paused, read it back, and smiled. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He worked for hours, sketching the homepage layout on paper, imagining what the user experience would feel like. He wanted the site to be more than functional. He wanted it to feel like someone reaching out and saying, I see you. You still matter. By mid-afternoon, he had created a mock framework. 3 core pillars: rebuild, relearn, and reconnect. Rebuild would focus on career support, resumes, job search strategies, and application tools. Relearn would offer digital workshops, LinkedIn training, branding refreshers, and upskilling in emerging tech. And reconnect? That would be the heartbeat: community forums, mentorship pairings, weekly group check-ins, and stories of reinvention. He took a break and stepped outside. The sky was overcast, but the air was brisk and clear. A neighbor passed by and waved. Ethan waved back. He didn't say it aloud, but the truth floated quietly in the space between them. Something's changing. Back inside, he called Melissa. Hey, she answered. What's up? I've been working on the gray matter structure. I want you to look at something. He shared his screen. She leaned in. After a few minutes, she nodded. This is good, Ethan. Like really good. You've built something here. Not yet, he said. But we're getting there. I talked to Diane earlier, Melissa added. She's reaching out to a contact who runs a nonprofit for mid-career women. They might be interested in collaborating. Ethan felt the spark again. Connections. Possibilities. Movement. By evening, he was drafting an email to an old client he hadn't spoken to in years, a senior recruiter who specialized in placing executive talent. He didn't ask for a job. Instead, he asked for insight. What did employers really think about hiring people in their 40s, 50s, or even 60s? What were the barriers? The biases? The blind spots? To his surprise, the recruiter responded within an hour. It's not that older professionals lack ability. It's that companies don't know how to frame their strengths. They don't know how to talk about adaptability, or leadership, or crisis management. They think tech fluency is everything. What you're building could help shift that. Ethan read the message twice. That night, over dinner, Rachel asked him how the day went. He hesitated for a moment, then said, I think I'm building something that might actually help people, not just as a side project, but as something real. She reached over and squeezed his hand. I always knew you would, she said. The next few days became a blur of early mornings and late nights. Ethan lost track of time, but not momentum. He designed mock-ups using free templates. He wrote copy for the homepage, the About section, the onboarding emails. He watched YouTube tutorials on how to manage small communities online and signed up for webinars on nonprofit digital engagement. Melissa helped shape the branding voice, simple, confident, human. They also decided to run a test group, a small beta of 20 volunteers from their original layoff circle and a few referrals. Ethan built a sign-up form and posted it in a couple of career support groups online, adding a short, honest message. We're building a platform for mid-career professionals who've been told they're too old, too expensive, or too outdated. We don't believe that. If you're interested in shaping something new, we'd love your input. Within 48 hours, 47 people signed up. They had a cap it at 30. Ethan was stunned. Every new registration came with a personal note. I've been out of work for a year. I needed to see this today. I was laid off at 50. No one's called me back. I want to help build this. I thought I was the only one. Ethan created a welcome email, inviting them to a virtual kickoff session on Sunday. He titled it, Welcome to Gray Matter, Rewriting the Rules Together. On Sunday afternoon, he logged in 15 minutes early. The meeting room was quiet, the screen blank. Then one by one, faces started appearing. Smiles, nervous eyes. A few cups of coffee raised toward the screen. When the clock struck 3 p.m., Ethan took a deep breath, unmuted his mic, and said, Hi everyone, I'm Ethan, and like many of you, I didn't plan to be here. But maybe that's the point. Maybe this isn't the end of something. Maybe it's the beginning. A beat of silence. Then nods. Then the chat lit up. Amen. Let's go. Ready. He walked them through the pillars. Rebuild. Relearn. Reconnect. The 3 tools that had helped him climb out of the emotional rubble. The 3 tools he believed could help others do the same. By the end of the session, the mood had shifted. The call had started with people hunched over, uncertain. Now they sat upright, asking questions, volunteering to lead subgroups, sharing their own stories in the chat. When Ethan ended the meeting, he didn't feel tired. He felt charged. Later that night, as he reviewed their comments, he came across one that stayed with him. I didn't realize how much I missed being seen. He stared at the sentence for a while, the weight of it settling in. That was it. That was the whole point. Gray matter wasn't just a tool or a network. It was a mirror, a reminder that being older didn't mean being over. It meant carrying a kind of strength that didn't come from textbooks or trendy jargon. It came from life. And now, finally, it had a place to live. Ethan closed his laptop and turned out the lights. He stood at the window, the city humming softly beneath him. And for the first time since that cold email 2 weeks ago, he didn't feel like something had been taken from him. He felt like he had found something instead. Not a job, a mission. And this time, no one could take it away. In the weeks that followed, Ethan fell into a new rhythm. One without a boss, without deadlines imposed by someone else, but full of urgency nonetheless. Each morning began the same way. Coffee, a glance at his gray matter notebook, and then long hours building something that felt bigger than himself. He wasn't being paid. There were no guarantees this would succeed. But the pull was undeniable. Every message he received from someone who found hope in the gray matter community added fuel to his resolve. The emails weren't just thanks. They were confessions from people who had spent years shrinking themselves to fit into a job market that made them feel invisible. One man wrote, "You reminded me that my experience is an asset, not baggage." A woman from Ohio shared, "After I got laid off, I stopped talking in meetings. Even in church. Gray matter is the first time I've spoken up in months." Ethan read every word. They didn't just move him. They anchored him. Still, it wasn't easy. Building a platform from scratch meant wearing every hat: designer, strategist, editor, community manager. Melissa helped when she could, and a few others offered support here and there, but the majority of the work fell on his shoulders. Some days felt like progress. Others felt like pushing a boulder uphill. There were moments, quiet ones, usually in the late evenings, when doubt crept back in. Was this all just a passion project destined to fizzle? Was he chasing relevance because he feared being left behind? But then something would happen. A new testimonial, a volunteer offering to help, an invitation to speak at a small online conference. And Ethan would remember, this wasn't about chasing relevance. This was about reclaiming voice. His own and thousands of others. One rainy Thursday, Ethan received an unexpected email. Subject: "We want to feature gray matter." It was from a journalist at a career-focused section of a national news outlet. She'd heard about the platform through someone in the test group and wanted to do a profile. A real piece. Interviews. Photos. The whole thing. Ethan's heart pounded as he read the message. At first, he wasn't sure. What if they got it wrong? What if they made it sound like he was bitter, like gray matter was born from revenge rather than hope? But the journalist's tone was thoughtful, respectful. She didn't want to paint him as a victim. She wanted to explore why midlife professionals were creating their own ecosystems, and how gray matter was quietly becoming one of the most talked about ones online. He agreed. They set the interview for the following Monday. Over the weekend, he prepared, not just by cleaning his home office and outlining talking points, but by thinking about how far he'd come. He remembered the email, the one that shattered everything. He remembered staring at the screen for hours. The aching silence in the kitchen that day. The Zoom call with Melissa and the others. The first scribbled words of the mission statement. And now this. A national feature. It was surreal. Rachel noticed a change in him too. "You're standing taller," she said one evening as they folded laundry. "Even when you're tired." He smiled at her. "It's strange. I've never worked harder for something with no paycheck, no promise of success, but I've never felt more awake." She kissed his cheek. "Because you're building something honest." The interview went well. The journalist was sharp, and her questions cut deep in the best way. She asked about the platform, of course, but also about Ethan himself. What had it felt like to be discarded? What had it taken to stand up again? He answered truthfully. "I didn't rise like a phoenix," he said. "I crawled like a man who forgot how to walk. I had to teach myself how to believe again." When the article went live a week later, the response was overwhelming. Traffic to the Gray Matter site quadrupled in 2 days. Emails flooded in. Offers to collaborate. Speaking invitations. One message came from a national workforce policy nonprofit. They wanted a partner. Another came from a well-known career coach who offered to run free live webinars for Ethan's community. But the one that stopped him cold was short. A single paragraph. It was from Ryan Carter, the CEO who had laid him off. "I've been following your work with Gray Matter. I have to admit, I didn't see this coming, but I'm impressed. Truly, I'd like to meet if you're open to it." Ethan stared at the message for a long time. He felt the familiar burn of resentment rise in his chest. Ryan had erased him with a sentence, had taken everything away with the stroke of a corporate pen. And now he wanted to talk? Why? He didn't reply that night. He went for a walk instead. Under the early evening sky, wind brushing through the trees, the world unusually quiet. He thought about what gray matter stood for. It wasn't about payback. It was about rebuilding, elevating, changing the narrative. Could Ryan be part of that? Should he? By the time he returned home, he had an answer. The next morning, he wrote back. Let's talk. Coffee next week. Ryan responded within the hour. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe near the business district. It was the same street where Ethan had once rushed from meeting to meeting, trying to prove he still belonged. This time, he walked in slower, straighter. Ryan was already seated, nursing an espresso. He looked nervous. Ethan, he said, standing quickly. Thanks for coming. Ethan nodded and took a seat. Let's hear it. Ryan exhaled. Look, I know I handle things poorly. I thought I was making the right call for the company. Cutting costs, streamlining, targeting a younger demographic. But it backfired. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Backfire how? Our culture tanked. We lost our depth. Morale's low. Turnover's high. And honestly, people don't trust us anymore. He paused, then added, I've been reading your stuff, watching the way gray matter's growing. I think there's something there. Something we missed. Ethan didn't speak. I guess what I'm saying, Ryan continued, is maybe you were the future, and I didn't see it. That admission, small as it was, landed like a pebble in still water. Not enough to erase the damage, but enough to create a ripple. What do you want, Ryan? Ethan finally asked. A partnership, he said. Help us build something better, more inclusive. We need guidance. And I think gray matter could be part of that. Ethan leaned back, thoughtful. He could have said no, could have walked away, but something inside him knew. Real change didn't happen from the outside looking in. Real change meant stepping into the very rooms that once shut you out. That night, as Ethan sat at his desk, reviewing the draft of a new mentorship initiative for Horizon, he glanced at a sticky note he'd placed on the corner of his monitor. For words, written in his own handwriting. This matters. Keep going. And for the first time since the email that started it all, Ethan didn't feel like a man rebuilding a broken life. He felt like a man building the future, brick by brick, for himself, and for everyone else who had ever been told they were no longer needed. The morning of the partnership launch, Ethan stood outside the downtown Horizon building with a strange sense of déjà vu. Just a few months ago, he had walked out of those glass doors feeling like a ghost, disposable, erased, betrayed by the very system he had once trusted. Now he was walking back in, but this time not as an employee, as a collaborator, as the founder of Gray Matter. He wore no corporate badge, just a calm, quiet confidence that came from building something out of the ashes. He took a breath, adjusted his blazer, and pushed open the door. Inside, the lobby looked exactly the same. Modern, sleek, polished, but something felt different. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was the way the receptionist stood up and greeted him by name, or how Ryan Carter came out from his office to meet him personally, no assistant in tow. Ethan, Ryan said, extending his hand. Welcome back. Ethan shook it firm but not cold. Thanks. Let's get started. They headed to a large conference room where Horizon's executive team had gathered. Ethan took in the room. Some familiar faces, some new. Most looked curious. A few looked skeptical. He didn't blame them. Ryan introduced him. Everyone, this is Ethan Reynolds, founder of Gray Matter. He's going to be helping us reimagine how we retain and empower experienced professionals across all departments. There was a beat of silence. Ethan stepped forward. I don't want to waste your time, he began. So I'll just say this. I'm not here to talk about diversity in age like it's a charity case. I'm here because your company is bleeding talent and trust. And because people like me, people you laid off, still have value. You just forgot how to see it. Someone at the end of the table coughed uncomfortably. Ethan didn't flinch. I've built Gray Matter on 3 pillars: rebuild, relearn, reconnect. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to help your older employees feel visible again. We're going to help your younger employees learn how to work with experience instead of ignoring it. And we're going to create systems that don't throw people away when they reach 45. A younger executive raised her hand. But how do we do that, realistically? We can't change the entire corporate structure overnight. Ethan nodded. You're right. But you can start with something simple. A bigger table. The room went quiet. Make space, he said. For both the intern who knows TikTok and the VP who's weathered 3 recessions. Pair them. Let them teach each other. Let leadership be something you grow into, not age out of. He pulled up a slide deck and began outlining the proposal. Reverse mentoring programs, cross-generational brainstorming labs, internal success stories, re-onboarding for returning professionals, and flexible pathways for late career contributors who didn't want to climb, just contribute. By the time he was done, something had shifted. The skepticism had softened into curiosity. The conversation turned from defense to possibility. By the end of the hour, a director from the product team leaned over and said, "We could use this. My team has high turnover, and we've lost a lot of institutional knowledge. This might be exactly what we need." Ryan closed the meeting with a nod toward Ethan. Let's build it together. In the following weeks, Gray Matter began piloting Horizon's first internal bridge program. It paired newer employees with veteran mentors, focusing not on hierarchy, but on shared goals. Ethan watched from the sidelines as walls began to come down. A 26-year-old coder named Matteo found himself sitting in weekly sessions with Judy, a 59-year-old systems analyst who had nearly left the company before Ethan returned. Their initial meetings were awkward, but slowly they began to learn from each other. Judy learned how to streamline her documentation using newer tools. Matteo began to understand the depth of risk management that no AI could teach. Judy told Ethan one afternoon, "I used to feel invisible here. Now, I feel needed again." That made everything worth it. But Ethan wasn't just focused on Horizon. Gray Matter was growing fast. The media piece had sparked something. Other companies began reaching out. Small firms, Fortune 500s, government agencies. They wanted workshops, guidance, partnership. He had to hire a team. Melissa came on board full-time as director of community. Diane took over content and events. Carlos started handling the digital infrastructure. What started as a tiny online group had now become a movement. They hosted virtual career clinics every Wednesday. They launched a podcast. They began building a national mentorship database. And as the numbers grew, so did the impact. But with growth came tension. One night, Ethan sat in his home office, staring at a spreadsheet. Server costs were rising. Their funding was thin. They needed investment, but he was reluctant. He didn't want Gray Matter to become another startup that sacrificed mission for scale. Rachel came in with 2 mugs of tea. "Bad day?" she asked. He leaned back. "Not bad, just heavy. We're making waves. But I feel like I'm standing in the middle of a storm with a bucket trying to catch rain." She smiled gently. "Then maybe it's time to build a bigger bucket." He looked at her. "You've always been careful," she said. "But maybe now is the time to be bold." The next day, Ethan called Diane and Melissa into a meeting. "I think it's time," he said. "We need outside funding, but on our terms." They began compiling a pitch deck, not just about metrics, but about mission, about what Gray Matter represented. They reached out to socially conscious investors, ones who understood the value of workforce equity, not just ROI. Weeks later, they stood in a small San Francisco conference room, pitching to a panel of venture partners. Ethan delivered the closing lines. "We're not trying to fix aging," he said. "We're fixing the system that punishes it. And we're building something that reminds people they're not obsolete just because they have more candles on their birthday cake." The room was silent. Then came the applause. 3 weeks later, they secured their first $750,000 in seed funding. Ethan stood on the balcony of Gray Matter's new co-working space, overlooking the city skyline. The hum of keyboard taps, quiet Zoom calls, and hallway laughter drifted behind him. It wasn't a corporate tower, just a modest floor in an old brick building. But it felt right. He pulled out his phone and opened an email that had just come in. Subject: "You changed my life. Hi, Ethan. I was laid off last year at 53. I thought I was done. Then I found Gray Matter. Today, I signed a contract for a new job, and I'm mentoring 2 interns. I can't thank you enough." Ethan closed the email, blinking back the sting in his eyes. This was more than a project now. This was legacy. He looked out at the horizon, no pun intended, and felt it again, that familiar fire in the quiet. The kind that only comes when you know you're exactly where you're meant to be. It was a cool, quiet morning in late September when Ethan arrived early to the Gray Matter office. The old brick building had once been a warehouse for typewriters, now repurposed into a warm, open space with long tables, scattered plants, and walls lined with prints bearing words like resilience, wisdom, and value isn't vanishing. It's evolving. He walked the floor with a fresh cup of coffee, pausing by the conference room windows as the early sun pooled across the wood grain. In less than a year, this idea, born from anger, confusion, and loss, had transformed into something real, something alive. But what struck Ethan most wasn't the number of users, or even the partnerships now forming across 3 major companies. It was the stories. He heard them every day now, not just in emails or testimonials, but in voices worn, grateful, shaking, sometimes tearful. In Zoom calls from kitchens and bedrooms and cars. In text messages that came in the middle of the night, when someone somewhere found enough courage to say, "I thought I was finished, but I just realized I'm not." That morning, as his team trickled in, Ethan sat down to prepare for a new weekly event they'd recently added to the platform, Legacy Lab. The idea was simple. Once a week, a member from the Gray Matter community would go live and share a pivotal moment in their professional journey, something they once thought was a setback, but that had become a turning point. The purpose wasn't to teach, but to reflect, to speak aloud what many had kept buried, to honor experience not as memory, but as medicine. Today, Ethan was the guest speaker. He wasn't nervous, exactly, but as he stared at the Start Live Session button, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the kind he used to feel before presenting million-dollar campaign pitches or addressing a full boardroom. But this felt more personal. At exactly 11 a.m., he clicked Start. The screen came to life. Small video squares popped up one by one. Faces, some familiar, some brand new. There was a man in a flannel shirt, joining from a rural home office. A woman with silver-streaked hair sitting beneath a bookshelf. A couple watching together, shoulder to shoulder. "Good morning," Ethan began, his voice steady but low. "I'm Ethan Reynolds. If you're new to Gray Matter, welcome. If you've been here a while, thank you for coming back." He paused, took a sip of water. "Today, I want to talk about something that took me nearly 2 years to say aloud without shame. I was laid off because I got older. Not because I failed, not because I broke rules, but because someone decided that experience was expendable." He watched the reactions, nods, furrowed brows, eyes narrowing with recognition. "For 24 years, I was the guy who showed up early, stayed late, trained new hires, built departments, navigated crises. I believed in the company I worked for. I thought loyalty would protect me. But when the leadership changed, so did the rules. And one morning, I got an email that said I no longer fit their future." He let that hang in the air. At first, I spiraled. I stopped talking. I avoided mirrors. I thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm done. But here's what I know now. I wasn't finished. I was just between chapters. Gray Matter was born out of that space. Not from clarity, but from confusion. Not from strength, but from survival. More nods. A hand went to someone's chest on the screen. I started with one notebook and one idea. What if experience was the product? What if we stopped trying to compete with the world we built and started guiding it instead? Ethan glanced at the viewer count. It had nearly doubled since he began. I want to leave you with a question I once wrote to myself in a journal. What if your greatest contribution is still ahead of you? Not behind, not forgotten, not out of date. Ahead. He looked directly into the lens now. That's why we're here. Not just to rebuild careers, but to rebuild self-worth. Because once you believe that your story still matters, everything changes. He ended the session with silence. No formal goodbye, just a moment of stillness. And one by one, the viewers typed messages into the chat. "Needed this more than you know. Thank you. I didn't think anyone would say it out loud. I'm crying right now, but I feel lighter." Subscribed. Not just to Gray Matter, to hope. When Ethan closed the session, he sat back in his chair and exhaled deeply. There was no applause, no spotlight, but there was something better. Peace. Later that day, while reviewing development proposals with his team, Melissa tapped on his office door and held up her phone. "You'll want to see this," she said. It was a direct message on Gray Matter's LinkedIn page from someone named Olivia Perez, senior editor at a major publishing house in New York. "Hi, Ethan. I've followed Gray Matter for a while. Your story and the movement you've built is deeply resonant. Have you ever thought about writing a book? We'd love to talk." Ethan blinked. He hadn't thought about it seriously, but now that it was in front of him, the idea didn't feel far-fetched. "I guess the world is listening," Melissa said with a smile. Ethan chuckled softly. "Yeah, for once they are." By October, Gray Matter was approaching 100,000 users. They'd launched an audio course series. Their podcast had cracked the top 100 in the careers category. And quietly, Ethan had begun drafting the book. Not a business book, not a how-to, but a manifesto, a truth-telling, a declaration that people in midlife didn't need to reinvent themselves into something new. They needed to remember who they were before the world told them to shrink. The working title? Still Rising, Building a Future After They Count You Out. Each chapter would follow a theme: worth, grit, grief, reinvention, legacy. But at its core, it would tell the story of what it means to be discarded and choose to rise anyway. Ethan wrote in the mornings while the city was still asleep, with the lights low and a pen in hand, not a keyboard. He wanted to feel the weight of the words as they formed. One evening, Rachel walked in as he finished scribbling the final paragraph of a chapter titled Invisible Armor. She leaned against the doorframe, still writing. He looked up, eyes soft. "Yeah, but this time, not to fight back." She tilted her head. "Then why?" He closed the notebook slowly. "To build something that outlives me." By year's end, Gray Matter had become more than a platform. It was a lifeline, a mirror, a movement. And as Ethan sat alone one snowy December night, reflecting on the journey that had started with a layoff and led to a legacy, he realized something profound. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're still here. And he was just getting started. It was a crisp January morning when Ethan stood at the back of the auditorium, heart steady but full. The event was Gray Matter's first in-person summit, a gathering he hadn't even dared to dream about during those quiet, uncertain nights when the platform was just an idea on a notepad. Now here it was, a room of nearly 300 people from across the country. Former teachers, engineers, marketing professionals, healthcare workers, laid-off executives, second career dreamers, all sitting together under a banner that read, "Your story isn't over." He had watched them arrive in waves that morning, nervous smiles on their faces, clutching tote bags and name tags as if trying to convince themselves they belonged here. And within just an hour, the room had transformed. There were conversations everywhere, laughter, tears, exchanged business cards, shared resumes, even impromptu pitches in the hallway. The energy was electric, not just hopeful, but certain. These people weren't done, and now they knew it. Ethan's name was called from the stage. The audience began to clap. He took a deep breath and walked forward slowly, letting each step remind him where he came from. He wasn't a CEO in the traditional sense. No polished bio, no corporate swagger. But when he reached the podium and looked out at the crowd, his voice was strong. "I want to tell you a story," he began. "Not the one you've heard in interviews or press pieces. A different one." He scanned the room, making eye contact. "I want to tell you about the night I almost gave up." The clapping stopped. The silence deepened. It was exactly a year ago. I was sitting alone in my car in a parking lot outside a grocery store. I just walked past a former colleague who didn't recognize me. Or maybe he did and pretended not to. I had no job, no plan. My bank account was shrinking. My confidence was even smaller. He paused. I remember gripping the steering wheel and thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe I had my shot, and now I'm just going to fade out slowly. Quietly, several people in the audience nodded, visibly moved. But then a thought came to me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even comforting. It was more like a challenge. It said, "Okay, let's see what happens if you don't quit." The room stayed silent. So I didn't quit. I built. First with doubt, then with help, then with purpose. He gestured to the crowd. And now here we are. Because none of us were meant to fade. Applause erupted. A few people stood. Some clapped with hands trembling. Ethan smiled, but it wasn't pride that washed over him. It was responsibility. Because this wasn't just about one man's comeback. It was about the ripple he'd unknowingly started. In the weeks following the summit, something shifted in the national conversation. Gray matter was no longer seen as a niche idea. It had become a framework, referenced in op-eds, podcast episodes, even corporate HR memos. Terms like midlife momentum, experience equity, and career reinvention began a trend online, often linked back to the platform. And with the attention came stories. Hundreds of them. A 58-year-old nurse who had launched a home care consulting business. A 61-year-old former teacher now running a curriculum startup. A man who had spent 3 decades in logistics and was now a podcast host for professionals over 50. They didn't just credit gray matter with giving them tools. They credited it with giving them permission. Ethan was flooded with speaking requests. Universities, companies, government task forces. But he accepted only a few. Not because he didn't care, but because he wanted to protect the spirit of what he had built. He didn't want gray matter to become a brand detached from its mission. He wanted it to remain personal. So, instead, he focused inward. He began hosting fireside video chats every other week for the core community. Small, private conversations where anyone could share their journey. No flashy slides. No press. Just humans talking. One evening, during a particularly emotional session, a woman named Beverly unmuted herself. She was 64, recently retired, but not by choice. "My company phased out my department last year," she said, her voice trembling. "I trained the guy who replaced me. He's 29. Nice kid. But I haven't stopped asking myself if I did something wrong. If I just got old." The chat went still. Then Ethan spoke, not as the founder, but as someone who had lived it. "You didn't get old, Beverly," he said. "You got underestimated. That's not your failure. That's their blindness." Her lips quivered. "But how do I stop believing it?" He leaned in. "By writing the next chapter before someone else tries to write it for you." As gray matter expanded, so did its offerings. They launched a mentorship match program, pairing experienced professionals with startups, nonprofits, and younger entrepreneurs hungry for guidance. The results were powerful. Suddenly, 50-something mentors were helping 20-something founders navigate crises with calm. Retired engineers were aiding green tech innovators. Former executives were helping minority-led ventures scale with confidence. And it wasn't charity. It was exchange. It was mutual. One of Ethan's favorite stories came from a woman named Dawn, 55, who'd been a fashion buyer for 30 years before being laid off. Through gray matter, she was matched with a young woman launching a sustainable fashion app out of Detroit. 6 months later, they were featured in a Forbes article as co-founders. Dawn later wrote to Ethan, "I didn't reinvent myself. I just finally found a place where my old self was still valuable." But it wasn't all smooth. With growth came critics. A few tech blogs accused gray matter of romanticizing age and resisting innovation. One article called it a nostalgia network for professionals who refuse to evolve. Ethan read the piece quietly, then closed the tab. He didn't need to respond. Gray matter wasn't about defending the past. It was about designing what's next. So he focused on just that. He brought in advisors from multiple industries, launched a scholarship fund for those attending retraining programs, opened an initiative for caregivers trying to return to work after long absences. He kept building, and the ripple kept growing. One night, long after the team had gone home, Ethan sat alone in the office. He opened his old notebook, the one where it had all started. Page after page of messy ideas. Phrases, questions, crossed-out plans, bold arrows. At the very bottom of the last page was a scribble he didn't even remember writing. "You don't need to be the loudest voice in the room, just the one that doesn't go away." He closed the notebook slowly and smiled, because he wasn't going away. None of them were. They had been pushed to the sidelines, told their time had passed. But now they were leading from the center, together, and the ripple had become a wave. February brought with it a strange warmth. both in the weather and in Ethan's chest. It wasn't the kind of warmth that rushed in like a flame. No, it was the quiet, persistent kind, like sunlight sneaking through blinds after a long night. It came with every email he read from someone who'd taken their first job interview in years. Every story of a rekindled passion. Every former executive who now mentored a 20-something entrepreneur with renewed purpose. Gray matter was no longer a project. It was an ecosystem. But Ethan also understood what ecosystems needed to thrive. Balance, boundaries, and evolution. That's why, when he received a formal invitation from the Department of Labor, he didn't immediately say yes. The subject line read, National Workforce Inclusion Task Force. Invitation to participate. It felt enormous, bureaucratic, institutional. But as he read further, he saw that the meeting wasn't just a policy roundtable. It was a high-level gathering of business leaders, education officials, labor advocates, and a handful of on-the-ground innovators. The email said, Your work with Gray Matter is reshaping how mid-career transitions are understood. We want your voice at the table. Ethan stared at the screen for a long while. The table. He thought back to what he'd told Horizon months ago. Sometimes, the answer isn't to fight for a seat at the table. Sometimes, you build your own. Now the old table, the one that had once discarded him, was inviting him in. He smiled to himself, not out of ego, but out of clarity. This was why he'd done all of it. Not to be recognized, but to be heard, on behalf of those who hadn't been. He clicked reply. Thank you for the invitation. I'd be honored to participate. The event was held in Washington, D.C., in a grand, wood-paneled chamber that smelled of polish and old paper. It felt like a place where decisions had weight, where voices echoed longer than they should. The chairs were heavy. The lighting was clinical. And yet, Ethan walked in with ease. Not in a suit, but in a simple gray blazer, no tie, and a small gray matter pin on his lapel. A silent promise to himself. No masks, no posturing. Just truth. The discussion began predictably, with statistics, economic projections, policy challenges. One speaker cited that by 2030, nearly one-third of the workforce would be over 50, yet most upskilling programs still targeted younger populations. Another lamented the bias in recruitment AI that filtered out older applicants based on graduation year. Ethan listened patiently. Then the moderator turned to him. Mr. Reynolds, we'd love your perspective here. What are we missing? Ethan leaned forward. You're not missing data. You're missing dignity. A hush fell over the room. You're talking about numbers, metrics, efficiency. But what you're not talking about is belief, the internalized shame people feel when they're pushed out of the workforce. The quiet erosion of self-worth when job applications go unanswered for months, not because of lack of skill, but because of perception. He paused, letting it sink in. Gray matter isn't just about training. It's about reminding people they are still valuable before a system convinces them they're not. That's what you need to address. Not just with funding, but with narrative. Someone from a major tech firm cleared their throat. But how do we scale that? Storytelling doesn't pay bills. Ethan didn't flinch. Neither does burnout from being told you're replaceable. Until companies see experience as a strategic asset, not a sentimental one, we're going to keep losing institutional wisdom. And it's costing us more than we realize. There was a long pause. Then a woman from a national trade union nodded. He's right. We've been trying to get our folks retrained, but they don't believe it's worth it. Maybe that's where we start. The conversation shifted, not into policy points, but into purpose. When the session ended, Ethan was approached by multiple attendees, some offering congratulations, others asking for collaboration. One whispered, You said what we've been afraid to say for years. And later that night, alone in his hotel room, Ethan looked out at the Washington skyline and felt something bigger than pride. He felt momentum, not for himself, but for the millions of people like him. People who had quietly questioned whether they still mattered, and were starting to answer, yes. Back in Seattle, the Gray Matter office buzzed with a different kind of energy. Word of Ethan's speech had spread quickly. The clip had been shared across social media, and Gray Matter's user base jumped by 15% in just 3 days. The team was growing too. Melissa now managed a volunteer network of over 100 mentors. Carlos had launched a new tech tool that allowed users to track their upskilling journey and receive personalized job matches. And Diane was working with universities to establish returnship partnerships, structured programs for professionals re-entering the workforce after long gaps. One afternoon, as the team gathered for their regular Monday check-in, Ethan looked around the room. There were tears in one corner, laughter in another. Someone was sketching out ideas for a virtual summit on the whiteboard. Another was editing testimonial videos. It didn't look like a company. It looked like a movement. He stood up. "I've been thinking," he began. "We've built something extraordinary, but we've only just started. What if we went even further?" The team turned toward him. "What if we didn't just help people re-enter the workforce, but help them reclaim their voice in every space? Industry, government, education, community?" Melissa raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like a fellowship program," Ethan said, "for thought leaders over 50. To write, speak, consult. Not to retire quietly, but to re-engage publicly. Let's create a platform for those who still have wisdom to offer, but haven't been given a microphone." The room lit up. Ideas flew. By the end of the meeting, they had a new initiative on the board, Gray Matter Voices. And just like that, another ripple began. A few days later, Ethan received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, on soft parchment, no return address. Inside was a note. "I heard your speech. I'm 62. I was a department chair at a university before I was quietly retired during restructuring. For a long time, I stopped speaking, stopped writing. I thought the world had no more use for me. Then I found your platform. I've started writing again. I'm mentoring again. I'm living again. Thank you for giving me a way back." No name, no signature, but it didn't matter. The message had already landed. Ethan placed the letter on his desk, beside his old notebook, the one with the frayed corners and the ink-stained cover. He opened it and flipped to the very first page. There it was in shaky handwriting. What would happen if I didn't quit? He smiled. Now he knew. You don't just rebuild yourself after being cast aside. You rebuild others. You build bridges. You build tables. And eventually, you build the future. Spring came gently to Seattle that year, as if the city itself was trying to be kinder. By now, the Gray Matter headquarters had outgrown its modest corner of the old typewriter building. The team had moved into a larger space just a few blocks away. Nothing flashy, just more room for bigger ideas. The old office was still theirs, though. Ethan refused to give it up. He called it the archive, though inside, it still looked and felt like the beginning. They used it now for small retreats, storytelling workshops, and late-night brainstorms when they wanted to remember what it was like before the spotlight found them. But Ethan hadn't changed much. He still showed up before anyone else, often with a notepad in one hand and a half-full coffee thermos in the other. Still wore his gray blazer more often than not. Still read every single story submitted to the platform, even when the submissions crossed into the thousands each month. And he still kept that same notebook on his desk, the one he'd started with on the day everything had fallen apart. Now, filled cover to cover, it was a kind of sacred text to him, the physical proof that clarity could emerge from collapse. One morning, he was rereading a few old entries when Melissa stepped into his office, holding her phone out like it might catch fire. "You need to see this," she said. It was a video clip, less than 2 minutes long. A 21-year-old business school graduate, speaking at her commencement ceremony. The crowd was large, the students excited, but the tone of her voice was calm. Grounded, she said, "I know we live in a world obsessed with youth, with speed, with disruption. But I want to say something unpopular today. I want to thank the people who got pushed out so we could come in. The ones who were told they were too old, too slow, too expensive. And I want to say to every company out there chasing the next trend, don't forget the ones who taught you how to build in the first place." She paused, then added, "Everything I know about leadership came from my mentor. She was 61 when she taught me how to present with courage. And she found me through something called Gray Matter." The audience clapped. Melissa turned the phone toward Ethan, whose eyes were already misting. "They're quoting us now," she whispered. "They're quoting the people now." He sat back slowly in his chair, not because he was tired, but because he was overwhelmed by the quiet, undeniable truth. This wasn't a wave anymore. It was a tide. Over the next few weeks, Gray Matter launched its new Voices Fellowship, just like they dreamed. Within days, over 3,000 applications poured in from around the globe. Writers, speakers, coaches, consultants, poets. People with decades of stories to tell. People who hadn't just survived the system, but had insights that could heal it. The inaugural class included a 67-year-old former aerospace engineer now mentoring climate startups, a 59-year-old black woman who had run HR for 4 major firms and was writing a book on restorative hiring, a 63-year-old former actor teaching presentation skills to Zoom fatigue teams. They weren't just mentors now. They were authors of the future. Ethan hosted the first virtual kickoff call himself. The chat box exploded with greetings, gratitude, and gleaming ambition. One fellow said, "I haven't felt this alive since my first day of work 35 years ago." The national attention followed. Gray Matter was now the center of a conversation that stretched beyond hiring practices and into cultural identity. Ethan was invited to a primetime interview show. The host introduced him as the man who made being 50 a power move. But what resonated most wasn't what Ethan said in interviews. It was what he allowed others to say. He always redirected the spotlight, pointed it toward the stories that mattered more than his own. A father of 3 who returned to tech after a 10-year caregiving gap. A midlife artist who now designed therapeutic visuals for memory loss patients. A grandfather who started a late-night podcast called The Encore Hour, where retirees told stories under soft jazz and candlelight. And then, in the middle of that whirlwind, something unexpected happened. A handwritten letter arrived at the Gray Matter office, postmarked from Spokane, Washington. It was from Greg. Greg, the graphic designer who had been laid off alongside Ethan that first morning. The man Ethan remembered slumped over his phone, too stunned to speak. They had lost touch not long after, with Greg slipping into silence and then seemingly vanishing. Ethan opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a 3-page letter. Greg wrote that after the layoff, he had fallen into depression, hadn't touched his sketchpad in months, had stopped answering messages, thought about disappearing completely, until one night, he came across a video. "Ethan, at the Gray Matter Summit. I couldn't believe it," Greg wrote. "You were the last person I saw before everything went dark. And there you were, on stage, speaking like someone who had turned the pain into power. I watched it 3 times that night. Then I opened my sketchpad. The letter ended simply. I'm designing again. Slowly. But I'm doing it. You reminded me I'm still here. Thank you." Tears rolled down Ethan's face as he folded the letter gently and placed it inside his notebook. Sometimes, the legacy wasn't loud. It was a ripple in the silence. That weekend, he took a drive alone, up through the hills outside the city. The roads were still damp from a recent rain. He pulled over a lookout point and stepped out of the car. No Wi-Fi, no cameras, no agenda, just wind and sky. He stood there for a long time, watching the clouds move across the horizon like slow ships. Then he whispered aloud, not for anyone else, but for himself. I did it, not because he'd won, not because he'd proven anyone wrong, but because he'd helped others remember who they were. And maybe, in doing that, he'd finally remembered himself. Back at the office the following Monday, Melissa found him in the archive room, staring at the wall. She smiled. "You okay?" Ethan nodded slowly, just thinking about the beginning. She joined him. "You were afraid no one would listen." He chuckled. "Yeah, and now they're not just listening. They're speaking." She paused and asked, "So what now?" Ethan turned to her, eyes clear, voice firm. "Now we build the second chapter." Because for every person who'd been pushed aside, told they were obsolete, or made to feel like their story had already ended, there was now a place, a platform, a promise, that your value doesn't expire, that your voice doesn't fade, that your best work might still be waiting. And Ethan Reynolds? He was no longer rebuilding. He was leading a movement, quietly, relentlessly, in a long light of a future he helped illuminate, not just for himself, but for all of us. If this story touched something inside you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or told your time had passed, then know this. Your next chapter hasn't just arrived, it's waiting for you to write it. So take a moment, leave a comment below, and share. What do you still carry that the world needs to see? Let your voice be heard. Subscribe to join a community that sees you, not for who you were, but for who you're still becoming. And remember, you're not done yet. You're just getting started.